A wall of mud and debris tore through the Arizona desert today. Some folks had to jump out of its path and barely escaped.
Took 20,000 gallons a minute out of a desert creek and sent it somewhere else. Below that wall, a stream bed carved by a river ran on a trickle. The pools went warm and green. The native fish nearly disappeared. Then, on a June morning in 2005, a power company closed the valves and handed music the entire flow back. No one in the American Southwest had ever done this. No one knew what a desert river does when its water finally returns. And the researchers waiting in that canyon were about to find out. The creek that builds stone. Tonight, we are learning more about the two men who drowned at Fossil Creek about 2.5 hours northeast of Phoenix this week. The first thing people say when they come around the last bend of the trail is some version of the same sentence. It is a gem. It is something you would never expect to find in Arizona. The creek is called Fossil Creek, and it cuts through a canyon, so deep you could stack the Statue of Liberty inside it 4 times over and still have room at the top. From the rim, the water is a thread of impossible color. Turquoise, almost tropical. The blue-green you associate with limestone country in Croatia. Not with a state whose standard summer landscape is red rock, dust, and heat shimmer. Despite the name, there are no fossils here. Early travelers found twigs, leaves, and stones sealed inside pale shells of rock. They looked petrified. The name stuck. What those travelers had actually found was travertine, limestone that water deposits out of itself as it flows. Fossil Creek carries water, so loaded with dissolved calcium. Fossil Creek. 1. It gives it that color. 2. It creates fossils when leaves or branches are fallen in the water. That wherever the current slows, the calcium comes out of solution and hardens into rock. A leaf drifts into a quiet eddy, sits for a season, and the creek encases it in stone. A fallen branch becomes the foundation of a ledge. Over centuries, the process built terraces across the entire stream bed. Low dams of pale rock stepping down music the canyon, each holding back a pool. Roughly 13 tons of fresh travertine are laid down along Fossil Creek every single day. That is not a figure from a geological epoch. That is today and tomorrow music and the day after. It makes Fossil Creek the 4th largest travertine system in the United States. An active, music-growing, self-constructing river. All of it depends on one thing. And in 1900, a rancher realized he could own it. The springs that never stop. Everything about Fossil Creek traces back to a cluster of springs at the base of the canyon. Not a snowmelt watershed, not a seasonal runoff channel. Springs. Water surfacing out of solid rock from an aquifer charging and discharging on a timescale that makes human history look like a rounding error. Those springs push out around 20,000 gallons every minute. In the units hydrologists actually use, that is a steady 43 cubic feet per second. And the word steady is doing enormous work in that sentence. Bow National Forest announcing a new permit process for Fossil Creek. They do it every hour of every day in the wettest year on record and in the worst drought the Southwest has seen in 12 centuries. At a constant 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, summer and winter alike. Understand how strange that is in Arizona. Rivers here are a seasonal rumor. Streams run hard in spring, thin through May, and by midsummer, you are looking at a dry wash with a few stranded pools and a great deal of cracked mud. Reliability is not a feature of desert hydrology. Absence is. Fossil Springs never got that memo. The water appears out of the rock at volume, at temperature, and it never stops. That endless flow built the most diverse riparian corridor in Arizona. More than 30 species of trees and shrubs crowd the banks. Cottonwood, sycamore, willow, ash. A ribbon of green stitched through a landscape of juniper, agave, and stone. More than 100 bird species move through every year. Decades later, an ecologist named Jane Marks would build much of her career on this canyon. Music, and the reason is buried in that consistency. A stream with a flat, unvarying baseline is a control variable in a landscape that almost never offers one. Music, change a single input on a system like that, and the change is legible. But before anyone thought to measure it, Somebody thought to take it, and killing a place like this turned out to require nothing more dramatic than a piece of paper. The takeover. People have been in this watershed a very long time. Archaeologists have found evidence of human presence going back perhaps 10,000 years. The Yavapai and Apache peoples made their home in this country, and they still regard the canyon as ancestral ground, not a scenic area, not a recreation destination, but the place their people came from. None of that carried legal weight in 1900 music, when a rancher named Lou Turner filed a claim on the creek. A year later, he claimed the springs and the headwaters themselves. On paper, in the language of Western water law, 20,000 gallons a minute of perfectly reliable water now belonged to somebody. The timing could not have been better for him. The mining towns of central Arizona, Jerome, Clark, Crown, Music King, were booming and starving for electricity. Hoists, stamps, smelters, lights, all of it needed power, and there was no grid to plug into. A spring that never quit flowing, dropping through a canyon with 1,600 feet of vertical relief, was not a natural wonder in that context. Music, it was a battery nobody had connected yet. What followed was one of the strangest construction projects in Arizona history. The nearest railroad stop was in Mayer, more than 40 m away across mountains and broken canyon country music, with no road of any kind. Not a bad road, no road. Before anyone could build a power plant, they had to build a way to reach the place where the power plant would stand. Trying to escape that summer heat, the gorgeous, refreshing swimming hall at Fossil Creek, located just between Camp Vary and Pack. So, they built one by hand. More than 400 mules and 600 men moved over 150 wagons along a trail cut into raw terrain. Scraped out a slope, blasted where slope would not cooperate, propped with cribbing where the ground music fell away. Most of the laborers were Apache and Mojave men working, in many cases, on ground their own families had crossed for generations. The cargo was the problem. Not lumber and canvas, turbines, generators, cast iron, and pieces that could not be made smaller. Cement by the ton in bags that split in the heat. The heaviest components were broken down at the railhead, hauled 40 m, and reassembled at the bottom of a canyon that dropped 1,600 feet music from rim to water. Getting down was worse than getting there. Grade-like that does not permit a wagon to simply descend. Loads went down on ropes and block and tackle, break by teams above inch by inch, with men below in the fall line, waiting to receive whatever came. A single component might take a full day, and in summer, the canyon floor sat well over 100 degrees. Men died on that trail. So did animals. Some of the deaths were falls. A slip on loose rock with a load overhead ends one way. Some were heat. Some were the ordinary industrial arithmetic of 1908, when a crushed man was a delay in the schedule and not much else. Nobody built a monument. Music, the names that survive are mostly the engineers. A bond issue raised $1.5 million, an enormous sum for the era. And on June 21, 1909, the Childs Power Plant came online. A second plant, Irving, followed between 1915 and 1916. To feed both, the creek was taken apart. Water was funneled through 8,800 feet of flumes, long channels running along the canyon wall, carrying the flow away from the stream bed and down to the turbines. And at the top of the system, near Music, the springs themselves, engineers built a 25 FT dam that captured almost the entire stream. Not part of it, almost all of it. The question nobody asked in 1909 was, what happens to a canyon when Music, you subtract the thing that made it? 70% of Phoenix. By 1920, the Childs and Irving plants together were supplying roughly 70% of the electricity for the growing city of Phoenix. Sit with that. Music, the streetlights, the streetcars, the first air conditioners ever installed in the Salt River Valley. The machines that made living in that heat tolerable and eventually made the modern Southwest possible drew their current from water welling out of a limestone canyon 100 miles away. Phoenix grew on that creek, not by drinking it, by spinning it. While the turbines collected awards, something else was happening a few hundred yards downstream. And almost nobody was writing that part down. Ghost water. Walk into the canyon below the dam in 1985, and the first thing that registers is music, the mismatch. The stream bed is enormous, wide, scoured, boulder-strewn, the shape of a channel that has been moved by 43 cub-feet per second for thousands of years. And running down the middle of it is a strand of water. You could step across without wetting your boots. 1 cubic foot per second, sometimes 2. A river's architecture with a garden hose running through it. That mismatch is what starvation looks like in a stream. Not a dry wash, a ghost occupying music, a space built for something far larger. The temperature went first. Deep moving water resists heat. Shallow, still water does not. Pools that had held cool, music, clear 70 degrees, flow warmed through the afternoon. And warm water and slow sun grows algae. The turquoise went green. Silt that a full current would have flushed, settled, and stayed, burying the pale, mineral floor that made the color possible. The travertines simply stopped. That process depends on volume and movement and starved to flow. The chemistry stalls. Existing ledges dried at the edges, cracked, and went chalky. Relics of a river that no longer ran. In a system that had been manufacturing 13 tons of new stone a day, the factory floor went quiet. Then, the fish. Several of Fossil Creek's natives evolved music in this specific set of conditions. Constant temperature, constant flow, calcium-rich water, travertine pool structure, and were adapted to it and nowhere else. Squeeze that habitat down, and they music do not spread out. They concentrate, crowding into the few pockets that still held decent water at densities that made spawning harder, disease easier, and every predator's music job simpler. And into that weakened, warm, fragmented system came fish that did not belong there. Non-native species music, introduced elsewhere in the watershed, perfectly comfortable in exactly the conditions the diversion had created. They ate the natives. They competed the natives for what little food and space remained. In the water the flume had left behind. Music. The invaders were not merely present. They were winning. For a creek whose entire identity was building music stone out of water, this was not decline. It was a razor, and it ran for the better part of a century, a few hundred yards downstream of a plaque celebrating the machine that caused it. What finally changed had almost nothing to do with the fish. The decision nobody had to make. By the 1990s, the arithmetic had shifted underneath the whole operation. The plants were old. Childs had been running since the Taft Music Administration. And on the scale of a modern grid, the power they produced had become almost trivially small. Phoenix in 1920 could be lit by a desert creek. Phoenix in 1995 music could not and was not. What once supplied 70% of a city's electricity now supplied a rounding error. Arizona Public Service, the utility that by then owned the plants, ran the numbers. Relicensing century-old hydroelectric infrastructure is not cheap. Environmental review, mitigation requirements, upgrades to aging equipment in a remote canyon with terrible access. Weigh that against the modest music power those turbines still generated. And the business case grew thin. In 1999, the company agreed to decommission both plants and return the full flow of Fossil Creek to its natural course. The details matter. No court forced this. There was no injunction, no ruling, no music consent decree with a judge's signature on it. The utility chose to give the river back. In a region where water is the single most fought over resource there is, where states sue each other over acre-feet and entire legal careers are built on who gets what out of the Colorado. A company voluntarily surrendering 20,000 gallons a minute was close to unheard of. It was only the second time in United States history that a dam had been dismantled purely for environmental reasons. The first was the Edwards Dam in Maine, and that project had an easier argument behind it. The fish it restored carried real commercial and recreational value. Fossil Creek was different. The fish this project meant to save, the suckers, the dace, the round-tail chub, had almost no market value at all. Nobody was going to build a sport fishing industry around a speckled dace. Nobody was going to eat a desert sucker for dinner. This was restoration for its own sake, and that made plenty of people ask whether it justified the roughly $13 million the effort would cost. Is a river worth saving if it never pays you back? That question hung over the whole project. And the man who answered it best was standing at the canyon rim on the day of the shutdown ceremony, asking the creek for forgiveness. Vincent Randall, Yavapai Apache tribal historian and councilman, Music, stood at the edge of the canyon. It was the same canyon where his ancestors had hauled cement and turbines up a trail that killed men and mules alike, where Apache and Mojave labor built the thing that took the water, where his people's music history and the dam's history were welded together, whether anyone liked it or not. Music, the crowd went quiet. His people had built this dam, he told them. They had been proud of its success, Music, across the decades. Proud of the work, proud of what it powered, proud that they had done something that hard in a place that unforgiving. But its time had passed. And then he asked the creek for forgiveness. That was the Music moment. The project stopped being an engineering decommissioning and became something else. A century of taking, acknowledged out loud by the descendants of Music, the people who did the taking at the edge of the water they took it from. The apology was the easy part. What came Music next was a year of the hardest fieldwork anyone involved had ever done. And if they got it wrong, the entire restoration Music would have backfired. The purge. Most people assume the story ends with a valve. Shut it off, walk away, let nature do the rest. That would have destroyed everything. By 2004, the stretch below the dam was full of non-native fish. And those fish were not going to retreat when conditions improved. Restore full flow into occupied water. And you have not rescued anything. Music, you have handed the invaders miles of new habitat, cooler and deeper than anything they had before, and the natives, already crowded to the edge, would have been finished off inside a few breeding cycles. Say it plainly. Turning the water on first would have spent $13 million, building a superb home for exactly the species the project existed to remove. So, the sequence came first, and the sequence was Music Brutal. In the fall of 2004, close to 100 people went into the canyon. Forest Music Service staff, Arizona game and fish biologists, scientists from Northern Arizona University, Jane Marks's group among them. Volunteers who did not fully understand what they had signed up for until the second day. There is no road down there. Everything came in on foot by pack animal or by helicopter sling load. Crews worked the creek in blocks, moving upstream, treating one reach at a time, and sealing it behind them. The work was done standing in the water, hauling nets, sorting fish by hand, hundreds of them, deciding species by species what stayed and what went in a canyon where the walls cut the afternoon light short and the way out was a climb. And at the downstream end, they built a barrier, a structure engineered to let water pass Music and stop fish from swimming up through it. Concrete and steel in a place where every bag and beam arrived the hard way. That barrier was the entire premise of the operation, because clearing a river of invaders is temporary Music, if the invaders can swim back. The purge bought the natives a clean field. The barrier kept it clean. The logic underneath all of it fits in 3 moves. Strip the creek of what does not belong. Hold the line at the barrier. Then, and only then, hand the native fish the one thing they had been denied for 96 years, Music, their river. By the following spring, the invaders were out and the barrier was holding. Jane Marks and her team had their instruments in place Music, and had them in place for years. Everything was ready. The only question left was what the water would do. And if that question is why you are here, rivers taken apart and quietly given back. Comebacks unfolding in canyons most people will never see. Music, subscribe before the next part, because what happened when they opened that canyon is the reason this channel Music exists. June 18, 2005. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut off the flume. For the first time since 1909, the full weight of Fossil Springs ran down its own canyon. It did not crash through. There was no wall of water, no surge, nothing that would make a dramatic photograph. 20,000 gallons a minute sounds like a flood until you remember it is spreading across a wide, dry, rocky stream bed that has been waiting almost a century to be filled. It crept. The leading edge moved at something closer to a walking pace and often slower. It felt its way into channels dry since the Taft administration. found the low line between boulders and followed it, hit coarse gravel and vanished into it while the ground drank what it needed. Then came up on the far side and kept going. Marks and a crowd of scientists, agency staff, and locals walked down the canyon alongside it. Nobody was in a hurry because the water was not. People got ahead of the front, sat on rocks, and waited for it to reach them. Side channels that had been dry cobble for 4 generations filled from the bottom up. Warm green half-empty pools took cold water at the head and pushed the stale water out at the tail. Stone that had gone pale and chalky went wet and bright, and the color came up out of it. Some of the people walking that morning were watching a river return. Some were watching an experiment begin. Both were true, and the second group had a problem the first did not. Nobody had done this before in a desert. There was no playbook and no comparable case. And every prediction offered that day was a guess. Professional consensus was that it would be slow decades, possibly a generation, before a system broken for 96 years resembled itself again. That was the reasonable, conservative, defensible position. It was also about to be tested against music instruments that had been recording for years. The thing that made this different, Jane Marks did not music, have to guess, because she had put her team on Fossil Creek years ahead of the shutoff. For years before the water returned, that team measured the starved creek in obsessive detail. Water chemistry, nutrient processing, photosynthesis, fish populations, travertine deposition, the full metabolic profile of a river running on roughly 2% of music, its own water. Then they measured all of it against a reference reach, a stretch of Fossil Creek upstream of the diversion that had never been dewatered and still ran at full natural flow, a healthy control in the same canyon, in the same water chemistry, fed music by the same springs. So when the flume closed, the question was not the vague one, not does it look better. The question was music precise. How close is the recovering reach to the healthy reach? And how fast is it closing the gap? That design turned a dam removal into an actual experiment. And within a single season, the data started music doing something nobody on the team had planned for, what nobody expected. The researchers had braced for a recovery measured in decades. Instead, they watched fundamental ecosystem processes, music snap back almost immediately. Photosynthesis in the stream climbed. The creek's capacity to process nutrients, music, the function that separates a living river from a channel with water in it, returned to levels matching the healthy upstream reaches. Not in years, in seasons. Think about what that means. 96 years of dewatering had not destroyed the creek's underlying ability to function. It had suppressed it. The machinery was still there. Algae, microbes, invertebrates, chemistry. The whole metabolic engine sitting dormant in a system denied its fuel. Music, give the fuel back, and the engine turns over. The lesson buried in that data was simple and in ecological terms, radical. A river is not a machine that stays broken once you break it. Give it back its water, and a great deal of the damage undo itself. Music, the usual vocabulary of environmental harm, is permanence, irreversible, lost forever. Past the point of no return. Sometimes that is exactly right. Extinction is permanent. But Fossil Creek demonstrated with instruments and control reaches and peer-reviewed numbers that one very common category of harm, the harm of taking water away, may not be permanent at all, provided the source is intact music, and somebody is willing to stop taking. The chemistry recovered first, the stone recovered next, and the stone could be measured with a ruler. Stone returning along the starved stretches. Mineral building had been dormant for decades. No flow, no deposition, and the ledges that remained were artifacts of a river that no longer ran. Once full flow returned, it started again almost immediately. New travertine dams rose along a 6 miles run below the springs. Some grew more than 2 centimeters every year, a rate you could mark on a rock face with a pencil and check the following summer. The turquoise pools that had defined the canyon began to refill and deepen behind those growing ledges. And because the ledges kept growing, the pools kept improving. The creek was rebuilding its own architecture. At that point, it was not being restored by people at all. It was restoring itself. picking up where it left off in 1909, as though the intervening century had been a pause rather than an ending. Water turning back into stone at a pace you could measure. The chemistry came back. The rock came back. But the fish were where the numbers stopped looking believable. The numbers that do not look real. With the invaders removed, the barrier holding, and full flow restored, the native species that had spent decades clinging on did not simply recover. They exploded. Music sonora suckers multiplied roughly 17-fold. Desert suckers climbed around 52-fold. The round-tailed chub, a fish that had been circling local extinction, surviving in fragments of habitat, came back about 70-fold. And the speckled dace, a small, unglamorous native minnow that had nearly blinked out of the canyon entirely, increased on the order of 150-fold. Do the arithmetic on that last one. A population sitting at the edge of vanishing came back more than 100 times over in the span of a few years. Not relocated, not restocked from a hatchery. Music, these were survivors breeding into habitat that had suddenly reopened without competitors, without predators that did not belong at full flow, and music stable temperature. Today, Fossil Creek holds 9 native fish species and a music distinction no other stretch of river in Arizona can match. It is the longest reach of river in the state where the native fish community is completely free of non-native species, not mostly native, free of them. In a western river system in the 21st century that is close to a unicorn. The recovery did not stop at the waterline. The restored corridor now supports somewhere near 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, music, and amphibians. In the 50-acre botanical area around the springs alone, researchers have cataloged 166 species of plants. A creek that had been quietly dying below its dam became one of the richest pockets of life in the Southwest, which created the next problem because a place that beautiful does not stay secret. And then the people showed up. In 2009, Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, one of only 2 rivers in all of Arizona to carry that protection. It was the correct decision, and it created crisis. Clear, warm turquoise water in the middle of the high desert is irresistible. And by the early 2000s, the word was fully out. Thousands of visitors